If I didn't
Freeman as young as he was.
That little sack of shit. Eighth from the front, he'll be first.
Most new fish competitions. And the call to freedom to fight for a free man this time.
Hello friends, if you are looking for a complete and in-depth review of this movie, The Shawshank Redemption 1994, you have come to the right place. In today's video, we'll break down the full story, explore the talented cast, analyze the box office performance, and highlight the most powerful moments that make this film stand out. So make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and let's get started. Andy Dufresne was a man who lived a life defined by structure, discipline, and quiet success before everything in his world collapsed in a single chain of irreversible events. In the outside world, he was known as a highly skilled and respected banker in Portland, Maine. Someone who understood numbers, investments, and financial systems with remarkable precision. People around him saw him as calm, intelligent, and emotionally controlled. A man who rarely raised his voice and almost never allowed his emotions to take over his judgment. Yet beneath this calm exterior, there existed a slow and painful emotional breakdown that he kept hidden from everyone around him. His marriage, which once represented stability and companionship, had deteriorated into emotional distance and silence, eventually revealing a devastating betrayal when he discovered that his wife was involved in an affair with another man, a golf professional who had become part of her private life, while Andy slowly drifted out of it without even realizing how far things had gone. This discovery did not turn Andy into a violent man, nor did it push him toward immediate revenge. Instead, it created an internal collapse that he processed in silence, a deep emotional fracture that he never openly expressed. He continued functioning in society, continuing his work at the bank, continuing to maintain his professional reputation, but internally he was no longer the same person. His marriage had ended in everything except legal formality, and the emotional betrayal created a growing void inside him that he struggled to understand or express. On one particular night, overwhelmed by emotional exhaustion and mental pressure, Andy made a decision that would place him at the center of a tragedy he did not directly commit but would be held responsible for nonetheless. That night, he drove alone toward the house where his wife and her lover were staying. The atmosphere was quiet, almost unnatural, as if the world itself was unaware of what was about to unfold. Inside his car, he consumed alcohol and sat in silence for a long time, holding a firearm that represented both possibility and destruction. His mind moved through memories, regrets, and unanswered questions as he remained parked outside, unable to fully decide what his next action would be. There was anger inside him, but it was not the explosive kind that leads to immediate violence. It was a slow, consuming emotional weight that made everything feel distant and unreal. He thought about betrayal, about lost trust, about the life he once believed he had, and about the emptiness that now replaced it. But despite everything building inside him, something stopped him from acting. A part of him, whether moral restraint or emotional exhaustion, prevented him from crossing a line he could never return from. Eventually, he drove away from the scene, leaving behind the moment that could have changed everything in a far darker way. However, fate does not operate on intention alone, and that same night, a crime took place that would completely reshape Andy's life. His wife and her lover were found brutally murdered, and what should have been a separate tragedy quickly became entangled with Andy's name. When the investigation began, law enforcement officers started collecting every possible piece of evidence that could explain what had happened, and in doing so, they constructed a narrative that positioned Andy as the most likely suspect. The fact that he had purchased a firearm, combined with his emotional state and presence near the area, became circumstantial elements that worked strongly against him. There was no direct proof of guilt, but in the absence of clear answers, suspicion filled the gaps. Andy, on the other hand, insisted on his innocence from the beginning. He tried to explain his actions, his emotional condition, and the fact that he had left without committing any crime. But the system he faced was not designed to interpret emotional truth. It was designed to process evidence, and the evidence being presented against him was enough to construct a convincing case in the eyes of the court. During the trial, Andy maintained a calm and composed demeanor, answering questions without panic or emotional breakdown. But this calmness worked against him. Instead of being interpreted as innocence or stability, it was perceived by the prosecution as coldness, detachment, and lack of remorse. The narrative built around him slowly transformed him from a grieving husband into a calculated killer in the eyes of the courtroom. As the trial progressed, witnesses were presented, arguments were constructed, and interpretations of events were shaped in a way that increasingly isolated Andy from any chance of defense. Despite his continuous denial of the crime, the emotional weight of suspicion, combined with circumstantial evidence, led the jury toward a verdict that would permanently alter the course of his life. In the end, Andy Dufresne was convicted of double murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The moment the verdict was announced, everything he had known about his existence collapsed completely. His career, his reputation, his personal identity, and his freedom were all stripped away in an instant, leaving behind a man who was about to be transported into a world that functioned under completely different rules. After the final judgment of the court, Andy Dufresne's life was no longer his own, but a sentence that would define every remaining moment of his existence. The transition from a respected banker to a convicted prisoner was not gradual or emotionally digestible. It was immediate, final, and irreversible. Within days of the verdict, he was transferred into the custody of the state and prepared for transport to Shawshank State Penitentiary, a place known for swallowing men and reshaping them into something unrecognizable from who they once were. The journey itself felt unreal to Andy, as if he were being carried away from one version of reality into another that no longer followed the rules he understood. The world outside, with its streets, buildings, and ordinary people, slowly disappeared as the vehicle moved closer to a place that existed beyond normal life, beyond comfort, and beyond hope. Shawshank State Penitentiary was not simply a prison. It was an environment designed to dominate human behavior through structure, fear, and repetition. Its towering stone walls, reinforced gates, and constant surveillance created an atmosphere where time itself seemed to lose meaning. When Andy first saw it from a distance, it appeared less like a building and more like a fortress built to contain something dangerous, something that needed to be controlled at all costs. As he passed through the main gates, the sound of metal, shouted commands, and heavy footsteps filled the air, marking his entry into a system that functioned with absolute authority. The transition from freedom to confinement happened not in stages but in a single moment when the gates closed behind him, sealing off everything he had ever known. Inside Shawshank, the intake process stripped every new prisoner of identity. Names were recorded, numbers assigned, and personal belongings removed without ceremony. Andy stood in line among other inmates, each man carrying his own story of failure, accusation, or misfortune. Some were violent, others silent, but all shared the same realization that they now belonged to a system that would define their existence. Guards moved with mechanical efficiency, issuing instructions without emotion, while prisoners obeyed without question, understanding that resistance only led to punishment. Andy observed everything quietly, absorbing the environment not with fear but with analytical attention, as though he were trying to understand the structure of a new and unfamiliar world. It was during this early phase of imprisonment that Andy first encountered Ellis Boyd Red Redding, a man who had spent years inside Shawshank and had become one of its most established inmates. Red was known among prisoners for his ability to obtain nearly anything, a reputation that gave him influence within the informal economy of the prison. He had seen countless men arrive over the years, each carrying different emotions: fear, anger, denial. But Andy was different in a way that immediately caught his attention. While most newcomers either tried to assert themselves or visibly broke under pressure, Andy remained composed, silent, and observant. He did not attempt to explain himself, nor did he seek attention. Instead, he studied his surroundings with calm detachment, as if he were processing the reality of his situation rather than resisting it. Red noticed this behavior with curiosity. In a place where survival often depended on emotional adaptation, Andy's lack of visible reaction made him unpredictable. There was no panic in him, no aggression, and no immediate sign of surrender. He simply existed within the environment without allowing it to define him instantly. Red had learned over the years that prison changed men quickly, often breaking them within months. But Andy did not appear broken in the conventional sense. Instead, he appeared distant, as if part of his mind remained somewhere outside the prison walls, refusing to fully accept the reality around him. As Andy was processed further into prison life, he became aware of the unspoken rules that governed Shawshank. Beyond the official structure enforced by guards and administrators, there existed a hidden system controlled by inmates themselves, where power, respect, and survival were negotiated through experience and reputation. Violence was not uncommon, and new prisoners often became targets if they failed to adapt quickly. Andy observed these dynamics carefully, understanding that survival required patience rather than resistance. He did not speak much during these early days, choosing instead to listen, watch, and understand how the prison operated at both visible and invisible levels. Shawshank was a place where time did not feel linear. Days blended into each other with repetitive routines, controlled movements, and strict schedules that removed individuality. For many prisoners, this structure eventually replaced their sense of self, turning life into a cycle that extended endlessly without meaning. Andy, however, remained in a state of observation, not yet surrendering to the psychological erosion that affected most inmates. He understood that adaptation was necessary, but he also seemed to carry something within him that resisted complete internal submission. Red continued to watch him from a distance, increasingly aware that Andy was not an ordinary prisoner, and that his story inside Shawshank was only beginning to unfold. Life inside Shawshank State Penitentiary gradually revealed itself to Andy Dufresne not as a single experience but as a layered reality, where survival depended on understanding both the visible structure enforced by guards and the invisible hierarchy controlled by inmates. As days turned into weeks, Andy began to realize that prison life was not simply about serving time, it was about adapting to an environment that constantly tested a man's physical endurance, psychological stability, and emotional resilience. The routine inside Shawshank was designed to erase individuality through repetition, forcing prisoners to wake up, work, eat, and sleep under strict supervision, with every action governed by authority. For many inmates, this structure eventually became their entire world, replacing the outside life they once knew with a controlled existence that left little room for imagination or hope. Andy, however, continued to observe rather than immediately adapt. He understood that survival required patience, but he also recognized that blind submission would lead to psychological decay. In the early phase of his imprisonment, he maintained a quiet distance from most inmates, speaking only when necessary and carefully analyzing the behavior of those around him. It was during this time that he became aware of the Sisters, a group of violent prisoners who exerted dominance over weaker inmates through intimidation and physical abuse. Their presence represented one of the harshest realities of Shawshank, where power often replaced morality and vulnerability was quickly exploited. Andy, being new and isolated, inevitably attracted their attention. The attacks from the sisters did not happen all at once, but gradually escalated, beginning with verbal harassment and evolving into physical violence. Andy endured these experiences in silence, not because he lacked awareness or strength, but because he understood that reacting impulsively could worsen his situation. The prison environment rewarded patience more than resistance, and Andy's ability to remain controlled under pressure became a crucial part of his early survival. However, the repeated assaults took a toll on him, both physically and mentally, creating a period in which he had to navigate the darkest and most vulnerable phase of his imprisonment without external support or protection. During this difficult period, Alice Boyd Red Redding continued to observe Andy from a distance. Red had been inside Shawshank long enough to recognize patterns in how prisoners adapted or broke under pressure. He saw Andy's quiet endurance as unusual, especially considering the violence he was subjected to. Unlike many others who either became aggressive or emotionally withdrawn, Andy maintained a calm exterior, though Red could sense that internally he was processing everything with careful thought rather than emotional reaction. This made Andy difficult to categorize within the prison's informal social structure. He was neither weak nor dominant, neither openly fearful nor aggressively confident, but something in between that suggested deeper resilience. As time passed, Andy began to slowly establish himself within the prison environment in subtle but significant ways. His background as a banker, though irrelevant in the outside world of Shawshank, became unexpectedly valuable within certain administrative aspects of prison operations. One of the turning points in his early imprisonment occurred when Captain Byron Hadley, one of the prison guards, was dealing with a financial issue involving inheritance taxes. While most inmates would have remained silent or indifferent, Andy cautiously approached the situation and offered insight based on his professional knowledge. This moment marked a subtle shift in how he was perceived by certain members of the prison staff. Instead of being seen solely as an inmate, he began to be recognized as someone with specialized skills that could be useful within the system. This interaction, however, did not immediately change his position among inmates, nor did it eliminate the threats he continued to face from the sisters. But it did create a small window through which Andy's intelligence and calm reasoning began to influence his environment in indirect ways. He was no longer just another prisoner. He was becoming someone who could navigate both the inmate world and the administrative structure above it. Red noticed this shift with growing interest, realizing that Andy's survival strategy was not based on force or confrontation, but on patience, observation, and strategic thinking. At the same time, Andy continued to endure the harsh realities of prison violence, especially from the sisters who targeted him repeatedly. These experiences became some of the darkest moments of his early years in Shawshank, testing his endurance in ways that went beyond physical pain. Yet, even in these moments, Andy did not lose his internal sense of identity. He remained mentally distant from the brutality surrounding him, as if part of him was already preparing for something beyond the prison walls, something that others could not yet see. This internal separation between physical suffering and mental resilience became one of his defining traits during this period. Shawshank continued its relentless routine, but within it, Andy was slowly beginning to carve out a space for himself, not through dominance or rebellion, but through quiet intelligence and controlled endurance. Red's observation of him deepened over time, and he began to sense that Andy's story was not one of immediate survival, but of long term transformation. While most prisoners were consumed by the present, Andy appeared to exist with a sense of direction that extended far beyond the prison itself, though no one yet understood where that direction would eventually lead. The deeper Andy Dufresne moved into life at Shawshank State Penitentiary, the more the prison began to reveal its true structure, not just as a physical institution, but as a psychological system designed to reshape human identity over time. Days inside Shawshank were not measured by moments of significance, but by repetition. Wake up, count, work, eat, return, sleep, repeat. The pattern was so consistent that many inmates eventually stopped thinking in terms of future or past and instead learned to exist only within the narrow boundaries of the present. For Andy, however, this rhythm felt unnatural but not entirely consuming. He participated in it, but he did not fully surrender to it. There remained a part of him that continued to observe rather than absorb, as if his mind refused to allow the prison to define his entire reality. The violence that existed within Shawshank was not always loud or visible. It existed in layers, sometimes coming from guards who enforced control through intimidation, and sometimes from inmates who established their own systems of dominance. Among the prisoners, the Sisters became one of the most feared groups, known for their repeated targeting of weaker inmates. Their behavior was not random but systematic, selecting individuals who appeared isolated or unfamiliar with prison life. Andy, being new and quiet, inevitably became one of their targets. What followed was not a single moment of violence, but a prolonged experience of intimidation and abuse that defined much of his early existence inside Shawshank. These encounters forced Andy into a state of constant awareness. He learned to anticipate danger, to understand the patterns of aggression around him, and to minimize his exposure wherever possible. Unlike many prisoners who responded to violence with either retaliation or emotional collapse, Andy chose silence and endurance. This was not an act of acceptance, but a calculated form of survival. He understood that reacting impulsively inside Shawshank often led to escalation, while patience, though painful, increased the chances of long-term survival. Even in his most vulnerable moments, Andy maintained a level of internal control that separated his physical suffering from his mental identity. Red, observing from a distance, began to notice this pattern with increasing curiosity. Having spent years inside Shawshank, Red had seen many men arrive with different personalities and coping mechanisms. Some arrived aggressive and quickly became involved in prison conflicts. Others arrived fearful and were gradually broken down by the system. Andy did not fit into either category. Instead, he existed in a quieter space, neither openly resisting nor passively surrendering. This made him difficult to predict, and in a place like Shawshank, unpredictability often attracted attention. As time passed, Andy's presence within the prison began to shift in subtle ways. Although he remained relatively quiet among inmates, there were moments when his external world intersected with the administrative structure of the prison in unexpected ways. One such moment occurred when Captain Byron Hadley faced a personal financial issue involving inheritance taxes. In a prison environment where inmates were typically ignored unless they posed a problem, Andy made a rare decision to speak up, offering insight based on his professional background in banking. This was not an attempt to gain favor, but rather an instinctive response rooted in his knowledge. He understood financial systems, and in that moment, he saw a problem that he could solve. This interaction marked the beginning of a quiet but significant shift in how Andy was perceived by certain members of the prison staff. While most inmates remained faceless within the system, Andy had momentarily demonstrated value beyond incarceration. It was a small opening, but in Shawshank, even the smallest openings could alter a man's trajectory. However, this did not immediately protect him from the violence he continued to face among inmates, nor did it change his vulnerable position within the prison hierarchy. The sisters continued their harassment, and Andy continued to endure it, each day reinforcing the brutal reality that survival in Shawshank required more than intelligence. It required endurance without visible collapse. Red's attention toward Andy grew steadily during this period. He did not approach him directly, but he watched him carefully, trying to understand what made him different from the others. In Shawshank, differences were usually erased quickly, either through conformity or destruction. Yet Andy maintained a quiet sense of self that was not easily disrupted. There was no outward sign of rebellion, but there was also no visible surrender. Instead, there was a controlled presence, as if he was waiting for something that had not yet arrived. Within this environment, time continued its relentless progression. The prison did not pause for individual suffering or personal development. It moved forward mechanically, reshaping everyone within it. But even as Shawshank continued its cycle, Andy's internal world remained distinct. He was still adapting, still observing, and still surviving. But beneath it all, there was a growing sense that his story inside Shawshank was far from ordinary. Something in the way he moved through the prison suggested that he was not simply trying to survive the system, but quietly studying it, as if understanding it fully was part of a plan that no one else could yet see. As Andy Dufresne's years inside Shawshank State Penitentiary slowly progressed, the prison began to shift from being only a place of survival into a complex system where unexpected opportunities occasionally appeared through cracks in its rigid structure. Andy had already endured the most brutal early phase of imprisonment, where violence, isolation, and psychological pressure tested his ability to remain mentally intact. Yet, instead of breaking, he gradually began to adapt in a way that was not driven by conformity but by understanding. He studied the prison, its people, and its systems with a quiet analytical focus, as if each interaction was part of a larger structure that he was slowly learning to decode. While most inmates were consumed by repetition and despair, Andy maintained a subtle internal discipline that kept him from fully succumbing to the emotional erosion that Shawshank inflicted on so many others. One of the earliest and most significant turning points in Andy's prison life occurred during a routine work assignment on the prison roof. Andy, along with several other inmates, including Red, was assigned to tar the roof of one of the prison buildings under the supervision of Captain Byron Hadley and the guards. The work was physically demanding and the sun was harsh, making the environment uncomfortable and exhausting. The guards, as usual, maintained strict control and displayed little regard for the prisoners beyond their utility. During a break, the inmates sat on the roof to eat their lunch, fully aware that they were being watched and controlled even in moments of rest. It was in this setting that a spontaneous yet transformative interaction took place, one that would significantly alter how Andy was perceived within the prison system. Captain Hadley, who was known for his harsh temperament and aggressive enforcement style, began complaining about a financial issue involving inheritance taxes that he had to deal with due to an unexpected legal situation. Most inmates would have remained silent or ignored the conversation entirely, understanding that engaging with guards was often unnecessary or even dangerous. However, Andy chose a different approach. Drawing from his professional background as a banker, he cautiously initiated a conversation, offering insight into legal tax structuring and suggesting a way Hadley could potentially avoid losing a significant portion of his inheritance. This was not done impulsively, nor was it an attempt to gain attention in a reckless manner. Instead, it was a controlled and calculated moment where Andy applied his knowledge in a way that was both subtle and strategic. At first, Hadley reacted with suspicion and irritation, as guards rarely trusted inmates who attempted to insert themselves into their personal affairs. However, as Andy carefully explained the financial process in a calm and precise manner, Hadley began to listen more attentively. The conversation gradually shifted from hostility to curiosity and eventually to cautious interest. Andy did not push too aggressively. Instead, he provided information in a measured way that allowed Hadley to consider the possibility that what he was saying might actually be useful. This moment marked a rare breakdown in the usual prison dynamic, where an inmate temporarily influenced the thinking of a guard through knowledge rather than force or manipulation. As a result of this interaction, Hadley and the other guards eventually accepted Andy's assistance in resolving the tax issue. The outcome was unexpectedly successful, and Hadley was able to retain a significant portion of his inheritance due to Andy's guidance. This single event dramatically altered Andy's position within the prison hierarchy. While he was still an inmate serving a life sentence, he was no longer perceived as just another prisoner. Instead, he had become a useful asset, someone whose skills had practical value even within the rigid boundaries of Shawshank. Following this event, Andy was assigned to work in the prison library, a place that at the time was largely neglected and underdeveloped. The library consisted of old, outdated books and limited resources, reflecting the prison's general lack of investment in rehabilitation or education. However, Andy saw something different in the library. Where others saw irrelevance, he saw potential. With permission, he began requesting books and writing letters to the state government, asking for funding and educational materials to improve the library system. His persistence was remarkable, as he continued writing letter after letter, even when most went unanswered or ignored. Over time, his efforts began to yield results. The library slowly started receiving donations, books, and educational materials, transforming it from a forgotten storage room into a functioning space for learning and quiet reflection. Prisoners who previously had little access to reading material began to use the library, and some even started studying for their education through Andy's guidance. This transformation did not happen overnight, but it marked a significant shift in the prison environment. Andy had managed to create something constructive within a system designed primarily for punishment rather than rehabilitation. During this period, Red's perception of Andy deepened significantly. He observed how Andy's influence extended beyond individual interactions and began affecting the broader environment in subtle ways. Andy did not seek power or recognition, yet his actions gradually altered the prison's internal structure in ways that were difficult to ignore. Red, who had spent decades adapting to Shawshank's rules, found Andy's approach unusual because it did not rely on survival instincts alone. Instead, it combined patience, intelligence, and long term thinking in a way that seemed almost disconnected from the immediate reality of prison life. Despite these developments, Andy's life remained far from comfortable. The prison system was still harsh, the rules were still strict, and the danger from inmates like the sisters had not completely disappeared. However, Andy's position had changed in a subtle but meaningful way. He was no longer just surviving moment to moment. He was gradually building something within the system that reflected a deeper understanding of patience and control. While others saw prison as a place where time was lost, Andy was beginning to treat it as a place where time could be used differently, even if no one else fully understood what that meant yet. As years continued to pass inside Shawshank State Penitentiary, Andy Dufresne's existence gradually evolved from that of a newly arrived inmate into something far more complex and influential within the prison's internal structure. The transformation was not sudden or dramatic, but slow and almost invisible, shaped by patience, consistency, and an unusual ability to remain mentally detached from the despair that consumed most prisoners over time. The library he had helped expand became one of the few places inside Shawshank where time felt slightly less oppressive, and inmates began to see reading and education as small forms of escape from the otherwise suffocating repetition of prison life. Andy's role in this change made him quietly respected among many prisoners, not because he demanded attention, but because his actions created a subtle but real improvement in their environment. Despite this growing influence, Andy's life was still defined by confinement, and the reality of his sentence never disappeared. The prison walls remained the same, the guards remained in control, and the system continued to operate with its rigid routines. However, something within Andy began to shift during this phase of his life. It was not hope in the naive sense, but a deeper and more controlled awareness that change, even in an impossible environment, was still something that could be worked toward in ways others might not immediately understand. This internal development remained hidden from most people around him, including Red, who continued to observe Andy with growing curiosity but without fully grasping the extent of his long term thinking. The introduction of Tommy Williams into Shawshank marked a significant turning point in Andy's journey, although neither of them initially realized its importance. Tommy was a young inmate, far less experienced than others inside Shawshank, and still carried a sense of youth and restlessness that had not yet been fully erased by prison life. Unlike many long term inmates who had adapted to the system, Tommy still had fragments of an outside identity, making him more open, expressive, and emotionally responsive. Andy, who had spent years in controlled isolation and careful observation, saw potential in Tommy not as a tool but as a student. He began teaching him basic education, including reading and writing, continuing the same patient approach he had used with others in the library. Over time, Tommy developed a sense of admiration for Andy, not only because of his intelligence, but because of the calm dignity with which he carried himself. In a place where most men were either hardened or broken, Andy remained balanced in a way that felt almost unnatural. This connection between them slowly deepened into a mentor student relationship where Andy guided Tommy through education and encouraged him to think beyond the prison environment. For Andy, teaching was not just a distraction from prison life, it was a way of maintaining a connection to meaning, even in a place designed to remove it. The true turning point came when Tommy eventually shared a piece of information that would change everything Andy had believed about his conviction. Tommy revealed that while serving time in another facility before Shawshank, he had met an inmate who casually confessed to a crime that closely matched the details of the murder for which Andy had been sentenced. According to Tommy's account, this man had described breaking into a house and killing a wealthy banker and his lover, a story that directly aligned with the case that had destroyed Andy's life. As Tommy explained this, the atmosphere around them shifted instantly. What had been a casual conversation between teacher and student transformed into a moment of devastating possibility. For Andy, this information reopened a part of his past that he had long tried to process in silence. Until that moment, he had lived under the assumption that although he maintained his innocence, the system would never reconsider his case. But Tommy's statement introduced a possibility that had not existed before, the possibility of actual proof pointing to another perpetrator. Andy listened carefully, his calm exterior masking the internal shock of hearing a narrative that aligned with everything he had always claimed but could never prove. Unlike emotional reactions seen in other prisoners, Andy did not immediately break down or become erratic. Instead, he processed the information slowly, understanding both its potential significance and its fragility within a system that rarely accepted inmate testimony seriously. Recognizing the importance of this revelation, Andy sought to bring it to the attention of Warden Samuel Norton. This decision marked a critical shift in his journey as it moved him from quiet survival into active pursuit of justice within a system that had already failed him once. Andy believed that if the testimony could be properly presented and verified, there might be a chance for his conviction to be reconsidered or at least investigated. However, the prison hierarchy and its embedded corruption were far more complex than he initially anticipated. What Andy viewed as a potential path to truth, Warden Norton viewed as a threat to the stability of the system he controlled. Norton, who had gradually built an extensive network of illegal financial operations using prison labor and external accounts, saw Andy not just as an inmate but as a valuable instrument in maintaining his hidden financial structure. Andy had been quietly managing financial records under a fabricated identity, unknowingly becoming a key part of Norton's money laundering system. The revelation from Tommy therefore presented a direct risk to everything Norton had constructed over the years. If Andy's case were reopened or investigated, it could expose not only a wrongful conviction but also the deeper corruption within Shawshank itself. When Andy presented Tommy's testimony to Norton, expecting consideration or at least acknowledgement, he instead encountered resistance masked as authority. Norton dismissed the claim, refusing to allow external investigation or legal review and instead chose to protect the system he had built. This moment marked the beginning of a darker phase in Andy's life, where hope and institutional corruption collided directly. The prison, which had already taken years of his life, now became not only a place of confinement but also a barrier preventing the truth from emerging. For Andy, the realization was deeply unsettling. It confirmed that the system he was trapped within was not designed to correct injustice but to preserve itself. Red, observing from a distance, began to sense a change in Andy's demeanor during this period. While he still maintained his calm exterior, there was now a deeper emotional weight behind his silence, as if he had begun to understand the true extent of the forces working against him. Yet, even in this moment of confrontation with systemic corruption, Andy did not lose control. Instead, something inside him began to shift into a longer, quieter form of resolve, one that would eventually define everything that followed within Shawshank. The moment Andy Dufresne presented Tommy Williams's testimony to Warden Samuel Norton, something inside Shawshank State Penitentiary quietly shifted into a more dangerous and controlled form of tension. What Andy believed to be a path toward truth and possible justice was, within the prison's hidden structure, treated as a threat to authority and stability. Warden Norton did not react with open aggression at first. Instead, he responded with calculated restraint, the kind of silence that often preceded decisions made not for fairness but for preservation of power. Andy returned to his daily existence in the prison with a growing awareness that the system he had begun to understand was not designed to correct injustice but to protect itself at any cost. Not long after this confrontation, Tommy Williams was abruptly removed from Shawshank under the pretense of a transfer. The explanation given was administrative, routine, and deliberately vague. But within the prison environment, such transfers were often interpreted with suspicion. Tommy himself seemed confused, but not fully aware of the danger surrounding him. He still carried the hope that his testimony might help Andy's case, not realizing that his words had already placed him in direct conflict with forces far beyond his understanding. On a quiet night, he was led outside under armed supervision, where Captain Byron Hadley and other guards carried out an execution disguised as an escape attempt. The official narrative would later claim that Tommy tried to flee and was shot while resisting. But those who understood Shawshank's internal reality recognized the truth beneath the report. Tommy Williams was silenced before his testimony could ever reach the outside world. For Andy, the news of Tommy's death arrived like a quiet collapse rather than an explosion. There was no visible breakdown, no outward expression of rage or despair that others could easily identify. Instead, there was a deep internal stillness that settled over him, heavier than grief itself. Tommy had not only been his student, but also the first real possibility of proving his innocence in nearly 2 decades. With his death, that possibility was erased completely by the same system that had taken Andy's freedom in the first place. The weight of this realization did not manifest immediately in action, but in silence, as Andy withdrew further into himself, processing the reality that truth held no value within the structure that controlled his life. Shortly after Tommy's death, Warden Norton confronted Andy in a private and controlled manner, that revealed the full extent of his authority within Shawshank. The conversation was not framed as a discussion but as a reminder of hierarchy. Norton made it clear that Tommy's death would officially be recorded as an escape attempt and that no further inquiry into his story would be permitted. He dismissed Andy's concerns entirely, reinforcing the idea that within Shawshank, the truth was not something discovered but something constructed. At the same time, Norton subtly reminded Andy of his continued usefulness in managing the prison's financial operations. Through his fabricated identity, Andy had been quietly processing illegal financial transactions under Norton's direction, unknowingly becoming a crucial part of a money laundering system that extended beyond the prison walls. This dual role, both prisoner and financial instrument, placed Andy in a uniquely controlled position where his survival was tied not only to physical confinement but also to institutional dependency. In the aftermath of this confrontation, Andy was sent into solitary confinement, a punishment that removed him completely from human interaction and placed him in an environment designed to break mental stability. The hole, as it was known among inmates, was a small, dark, and silent cell where time ceased to have meaning. Days and nights lost distinction, and the absence of sound or contact created an environment where even the strongest minds could begin to fracture. For Andy, this isolation represented both punishment and reflection. Cut off from the outside world, he was forced to confront not only the injustice of his situation but also the complete failure of any remaining institutional hope for redemption. Inside solitary confinement, Andy's perception of time began to dissolve. Without external interaction, his thoughts turned inward, moving through memories, possibilities, and patterns of behavior he had observed over years inside Shawshank. Unlike many inmates who broke under isolation, Andy did not surrender to panic or emotional collapse. Instead, he entered a state of deep internal focus where silence became both burden and tool. It was during this period that his understanding of Shawshank as a system reached its clearest form. He no longer viewed it as a place of punishment alone, but as a structure built on control, corruption, and repetition, where survival depended on long-term thinking rather than immediate reaction. When Andy was eventually released from solitary confinement after weeks of isolation, he emerged physically unchanged but internally altered. The loss of Tommy, the dismissal of his testimony, and the realization of Norton's complete control over truth had removed any remaining belief that institutional justice would ever acknowledge his innocence. Yet, instead of breaking him, this realization appeared to refine his internal resolve. Red, observing him from a distance, noticed a subtle but undeniable shift. Andy was quieter than before, not in the sense of weakness, but in a more deliberate and contained way, as if something within him had moved beyond the need for immediate reaction and entered a state of long-term purpose. From this point forward, Andy's behavior began to change in ways that were not immediately visible to others. While he continued his responsibilities within the prison, including his financial work for Warden Norton, there was an underlying sense that his mind was no longer operating solely within the present environment. Instead, it appeared as though he had begun to construct something internally, an understanding, a plan, or a possibility that extended far beyond the boundaries of Shawshank itself. What others saw as silence was, in reality, preparation. What others interpreted as acceptance was, in truth, the beginning of something far more deliberate. After Tommy Williams was taken away from Shawshank, the prison did not feel immediately different on the surface. But for Andy Dufresne, something inside the environment had permanently changed. The system had once again revealed its true nature, not as a place where truth mattered, but as a place where truth could be erased without consequence. Tommy's absence was explained away with official statements and controlled narratives. Yet, among the inmates who understood Shawshank's unspoken rules, there was little doubt about what had actually happened. People did not openly discuss it, but silence inside the prison often carried more meaning than words ever could. Andy, however, did not react in a visible or emotional way. Instead, he absorbed the reality quietly, as if locking it away in a deeper part of his mind where it would remain permanently understood but not outwardly expressed. Warden Norton's authority over Shawshank became even more pronounced after Tommy's death. He did not need to justify his decisions to inmates, nor did he need to acknowledge their emotional weight. In his world, control was maintained through structure, fear, and selective ignorance. Andy, meanwhile, remained in his assigned role, continuing the financial work that Norton had come to rely on. Through the false identity of Randall Stephens, Andy had been managing a growing system of illegal transactions, carefully structured accounts, and hidden financial movements that extended far beyond the prison itself. What made this arrangement particularly dangerous was not just its illegality, but the fact that Andy had become essential to it. Norton depended on him, even while treating him as disposable. This contradiction created a unique and unstable balance of power within Shawshank. On one hand, Andy was powerless, physically confined, and fully under institutional control. On the other hand, his knowledge and skills had made him indispensable to the very system that imprisoned him. This duality did not offer freedom, but it created leverage in ways that were not immediately visible. Andy understood this dynamic with increasing clarity, though he never openly acknowledged it. Instead, he continued to perform his duties with the same calm precision that had defined his behavior since the beginning of his imprisonment, while internally processing the implications of everything that had occurred. The memory of Tommy's testimony and death lingered in Andy's awareness, not as an emotional wound that demanded constant expression, but as a structural realization about the nature of Shawshank itself. It confirmed what he had gradually begun to understand over years of observation, that the prison did not function as a system of justice, but as a self preserving mechanism where truth was subordinate to authority. In such a system, innocence was irrelevant unless it aligned with institutional interest. This understanding did not lead Andy toward open rebellion or emotional collapse. Instead, it pushed him further into a state of internal withdrawal, where his thoughts became increasingly focused on long term possibilities rather than immediate circumstances. Following Tommy's removal, Andy spent a period in solitary confinement, which only deepened this internal shift. The isolation removed all external noise, leaving him alone with his thoughts in an environment designed to break mental stability. The silence of the cell was absolute, broken only by minimal human interaction, and the passage of indistinguishable time. Days and nights blended together, creating a psychological condition where time lost structure and identity. For many inmates, this form of punishment led to emotional breakdown or psychological fragmentation. For Andy, however, it became a space of concentrated reflection. Without distraction, he was forced to confront the totality of his situation with complete clarity. In this isolation, Andy did not become chaotic or desperate. Instead, he became increasingly focused in a quiet, controlled way. He reviewed everything he had observed since arriving at Shawshank: the behavior of guards, the internal economy of inmates, the patterns of corruption within administration, and the ways in which information was controlled and manipulated. He began to understand that Shawshank was not simply a prison, but a closed system that maintained itself through repetition, secrecy, and selective enforcement of rules. Within such a system, survival was not achieved through confrontation, but through patience, observation, and long term positioning. When Andy was eventually released from solitary confinement, he returned to general prison life, physically unchanged but internally more detached than before. The experience had not broken him in a visible sense, but it had removed any remaining illusion that the system would act in accordance with justice. Red, observing Andy from a distance, noticed this subtle transformation. Andy still performed his duties, still interacted when necessary, and still maintained his calm demeanor. But there was a deeper stillness in him now, as if part of his attention was no longer fully anchored to the present environment. It was not escape in a physical sense, but a shift in mental orientation where his thoughts appeared to extend beyond the immediate reality of Shawshank. At this stage, Andy's life inside the prison had entered a new phase, one defined not by reaction to events, but by internal processing of everything he had come to understand. The loss of Tommy, the control exerted by Warden Norton, and the experience of isolation had collectively reshaped his perception of what survival meant. It was no longer just about enduring prison life day by day. It had become something quieter, deeper, and far more deliberate, though the true nature of that direction was not yet visible to anyone around him. As time continued to stretch forward inside Shawshank State Penitentiary, Andy Dufresne's existence settled into a strange and quiet rhythm that appeared ordinary on the surface but carried a far deeper internal structure beneath it. After the loss of Tommy and the tightening grip of Warden Norton's control, Andy no longer engaged with the prison system in the same way he once had. He still performed his duties, still worked within the financial operations assigned to him under the false identity created by Norton, and still maintained the calm, disciplined behavior that had become his defining trait. However, internally, something had fundamentally shifted. The prison was no longer something he was simply enduring day by day. It had become something he was studying, analyzing, and slowly deconstructing in his mind with a level of patience that most people around him could not perceive. The library, which had once been a modest project of improvement and hope, now stood as one of the most meaningful contributions Andy had made within Shawshank. Over the years, it had grown from a neglected storage space into a functioning educational environment where inmates could read, learn, and momentarily escape the psychological weight of incarceration. Books continued to arrive through Andy's persistent letter writing campaigns, each request carefully composed and sent to state officials in a tone that balanced professionalism with quiet determination. Many of these letters were ignored for long periods, but Andy never stopped writing them. His persistence eventually created small but consistent improvements, and the library slowly transformed into a symbol of intellectual resistance within a system designed to suppress individuality. For Andy, however, the library was more than just an improvement project. It was a controlled space within an uncontrolled environment, a place where knowledge could exist without immediate interference. While other inmates used it for reading and distraction, Andy used it as a quiet center of stability, a place where he could think beyond the immediate constraints of Shawshank. It was here that he continued to maintain a sense of internal order, even as the external world of the prison remained rigid and unchanging. Red, who had known Andy for many years by this point, observed this evolution closely. He noticed that Andy's presence in the library was not just about administration or reading, but about something deeper that seemed connected to long-term thought rather than short-term survival. During this period, Andy also continued his financial work for Warden Norton under the fabricated identity of Randall Stephens. What began as a useful skill that earned him limited protection had gradually developed into a complex system of financial manipulation that extended beyond the prison walls. Andy was responsible for organizing, structuring, and processing illegal funds in a way that allowed Norton to build a hidden financial empire. These transactions were carefully designed to avoid detection, and Andy executed them with the same precision he had once used in his banking career. However, unlike his previous life, this work now existed within a morally corrupt framework that he neither controlled nor benefited from. Instead, it bound him further into the prison's structure, making him both valuable and trapped at the same time. Despite this entanglement, Andy's internal awareness of Shawshank continued to deepen. He understood that the prison functioned not just through physical confinement but through dependency. Every role, every interaction, and every system within Shawshank was designed to reinforce its own stability. Even corruption served a structural purpose, ensuring that those in power remained protected while others remained controlled. Andy's position within this system gave him a unique perspective. He was both inside it and adjacent to it, involved in its operations but not emotionally aligned with its intentions. This dual existence allowed him to see patterns that others either ignored or accepted as normal. The idea of escape, however, was not something that manifested suddenly or emotionally. It was not driven by panic or desperation. Instead, it emerged gradually through observation, repetition, and an understanding of how systems create their own blind spots. Andy began to recognize that Shawshank, despite its apparent strength, was still dependent on routines, assumptions, and overlooked details. Every system, no matter how controlled, contained small gaps, moments where attention was divided, structures were predictable, or behaviors were assumed rather than verified. These gaps, while invisible to most, became increasingly significant in Andy's internal thinking. Red noticed that Andy's behavior had subtly changed over time. There was no dramatic shift, no obvious indication of planning or resistance, but there was a growing sense of internal distance, as if Andy was no longer fully anchored to the immediate reality of prison life. He still spoke when necessary, still performed his responsibilities, and still maintained his calm exterior. But something about his attention seemed directed elsewhere. It was not escapism in a simple sense, but a form of sustained internal focus that extended beyond the present environment. Red, who had spent decades inside Shawshank and understood its psychological effects deeply, could sense that Andy was no longer thinking only in terms of survival. At this stage of his imprisonment, Andy's life had reached a point where external events no longer defined his direction. Instead, everything he observed, experienced, and endured was being processed through a longer framework of understanding. Shawshank had not broken him in the way it broke many others, but it had reshaped his perception of time, patience, and possibility. What others saw as routine, Andy was beginning to interpret as structure. What others accepted as permanence, Andy was beginning to analyze as a system with limitations. And within those limitations, quietly and without declaration, the foundation of something far more deliberate was beginning to form. As the years continued to accumulate inside Shawshank State Penitentiary, the passage of time became less like a linear experience and more like a heavy, repetitive cycle that reshaped every inmate in its path. For most prisoners, decades inside Shawshank meant gradual surrender to routine, where days lost meaning and the outside world slowly faded into something distant and almost unreal. But for Andy Dufresne, time began to take on a different function. Instead of simply enduring it, he started to understand it, measure it, and in a quiet and deeply internal way, use it. What appeared on the surface as ordinary prison life was in reality becoming a carefully observed system in which Andy had begun identifying patterns that others either ignored or accepted without question. The library remained the most visible symbol of Andy's influence within Shawshank. Over the years, it had transformed from a neglected room into a structured space filled with books, educational material, and a quiet sense of intellectual refuge. Inmates who once spent their days in silence or aimless routine now had access to reading and learning, and some even began to experience small but meaningful shifts in how they viewed themselves and their circumstances. Andy's persistent letters to state authorities continued without interruption, each one written with calm precision and an unwavering sense of purpose. Many were never answered, and many were ignored, but enough eventually received attention to result in gradual improvements, including donated books, records, and educational resources. This slow transformation of the library reflected Andy's broader approach to life inside Shawshank: steady, patient, and built on long term persistence rather than immediate results. However, beneath this visible contribution, another layer of Andy's life was unfolding in complete silence. His work for Warden Norton under the false identity of Randall Stephens had evolved into a complex and highly controlled financial operation. What began as a simple application of banking knowledge had grown into a sophisticated system of money management, laundering, and accounting that extended beyond the prison walls. Andy processed financial records with precision, ensuring that the illegal funds flowing through Norton's network remained hidden under layers of fabricated legitimacy. Every transaction was carefully structured, every record meticulously maintained, and every detail handled with an attention that made the entire system possible. In the eyes of the prison administration, Andy had become an essential tool, even though his official status remained that of a prisoner serving a life sentence. This dual existence created a paradox that defined Andy's life more than anything else during this period. On one hand, he was confined within a maximum security prison with no legal freedom or recognized innocence. On the other hand, he had become a central functional component of a corrupt financial structure that depended on his knowledge and discipline. This contradiction placed him in a position that was both deeply restricted and subtly influential. He was not free, yet he was necessary. He was not powerful, yet he held knowledge that others relied upon. This balance, unstable as it was, became part of the internal structure that Andy began to understand more clearly with each passing year. It was during this long phase of controlled routine that the idea of escape began to take shape within Andy's mind, not as an emotional reaction, but as a logical extension of everything he had observed. Shawshank, despite its apparent strength, was still a system built on assumptions. Assumptions about trust, visibility, and permanence. Guards assumed inmates remained within certain physical and behavioral boundaries. Administration assumed that systems of control were sufficient to prevent deviation. And the prison itself operated on the belief that time alone would break resistance. Andy's growing understanding of these assumptions allowed him to see that no system, no matter how rigid, was entirely without gaps. At the center of this hidden development was a small object that, to anyone else, would have seemed insignificant. A rock hammer, originally requested by Andy under the pretense of geological hobby work, became something far more important over time. To outsiders, it appeared harmless, a tool too small to pose any real threat or purpose beyond simple carving or study. But Andy, through patience and extraordinary discipline, began to see its potential differently. The rock hammer was not powerful in itself, but it represented something far more valuable inside Shawshank: time. And time, when combined with absolute consistency and secrecy, could become a force capable of altering even the most controlled environment. What followed was not an abrupt action, but a prolonged and silent process that stretched across years. Andy began using the rock hammer in a way that no one else could easily detect, gradually working on the structure of his confinement in a manner so subtle that it blended completely into the background of prison life. Every sound, every movement, and every moment of attention was carefully controlled. The walls of Shawshank, thick and imposing as they were, contained weaknesses that were not immediately visible. Over time, Andy learned to recognize these weaknesses not through force, but through repetition and observation. The process required extraordinary patience, not measured in days or weeks, but in years that passed almost invisibly. Throughout this period, Andy maintained his outward role within the prison without deviation. He continued his work in the library, continued his financial responsibilities under Norton's system, and continued to interact with inmates and guards in a controlled and measured manner. Nothing about his visible behavior suggested what was slowly taking shape beneath the surface of his routine existence. Red, observing him over the years, noticed that Andy remained consistent in appearance and behavior. Yet there was an unshakable sense that his attention was no longer fully contained within the present moment. It was as if part of him existed somewhere beyond the immediate boundaries of Shawshank, focused on something that had not yet revealed itself to the outside world. At this stage, Andy's life inside Shawshank was no longer defined solely by survival or adaptation. It had become something far more deliberate and internally structured. Every action, every interaction, and every passing year seemed to fit into a larger pattern that only he fully understood. While the prison continued its endless cycle of routine and control, Andy was quietly operating within a different timeline altogether, one shaped not by authority or confinement, but by patience, observation, and the gradual construction of an outcome that remained hidden from everyone around him. As the long years stretched deeper into Andy Dufresne's imprisonment at Shawshank State Penitentiary, the prison itself continued its unchanging rhythm, as if time inside its walls had been permanently frozen into a cycle of repetition. For most inmates, the passing decades meant little more than gradual adaptation to routine, where the distinction between days, months, and years slowly dissolved into a single continuous experience of confinement. But for Andy, time had become something else entirely. It was no longer just something to endure, but something to structure, measure, and quietly work within. Beneath the visible surface of his daily life, an invisible progression was unfolding, one that remained completely hidden from the prison's awareness. On the outside, Andy's life still appeared consistent and controlled. He continued his responsibilities in the prison library, maintaining its organization, assisting inmates with reading and education, and ensuring that the small improvements he had fought for over the years remained stable. The library had become one of the few places inside Shawshank where the oppressive weight of the prison felt slightly reduced, not because it offered freedom, but because it offered thought. Books filled the space with ideas that extended beyond the prison walls, and inmates who engaged with them often experienced brief moments of mental escape from their otherwise confined existence. Andy understood the importance of this environment, not just as a contribution to others, but as part of a larger structure that supported his long term internal focus. At the same time, his financial work for Warden Norton continued without interruption. Under the fabricated identity of Randall Stephens, Andy managed increasingly complex financial operations that extended far beyond Shawshank's physical boundaries. What had once been a simple task of accounting had evolved into a fully developed system of illegal financial movement, carefully concealed through layers of documentation and structured transactions. Norton's reliance on Andy grew over time, making him indispensable to the financial stability of the warden's hidden empire. This dependence created a strange and dangerous contradiction where Andy remained both completely imprisoned and quietly essential to the system that confined him. However, what remained entirely invisible to everyone around him was the long term process that had been unfolding for years beneath this surface level existence. The small rock hammer that Andy had once requested for harmless purposes had, over time, become part of a patient and nearly imperceptible project. Without drawing attention or disrupting his visible routine, Andy had been working consistently in a manner so subtle that even those closest to him inside the prison had no awareness of it. The process was not rushed or emotional. It was methodical, controlled, and extended across years of absolute discipline. Every action was carefully integrated into the normal rhythm of prison life, ensuring that nothing appeared unusual or out of place. The structure of Shawshank itself, with its heavy stone walls and reinforced construction, created an illusion of absolute permanence. To anyone observing casually, escape would have seemed impossible, not because of visible barriers alone, but because of the psychological certainty that the system inspired. The prison was designed not just to hold bodies, but to convince minds that no alternative existed. Yet, Andy's growing understanding of Shawshank had revealed something different. Beneath its appearance of total control were small inconsistencies, unnoticed gaps in attention, and structural assumptions that could be quietly observed and gradually used. It was within these unnoticed spaces that Andy's long term actions were slowly taking shape. Over time, the accumulation of years began to produce subtle changes in Andy himself. Outwardly, he remained unchanged, calm, composed, and consistent in behavior. But internally, his perception of time and purpose had become deeply structured around a single, sustained objective. He no longer viewed prison life as a series of isolated days, but as a continuous system in which every moment contributed to something larger. Even routine interactions, repetitive tasks, and ordinary movements within Shawshank became part of a broader internal framework that only he fully understood. Red, who had observed Andy for many years by this point, sensed that something fundamental had shifted in him, although nothing visible clearly revealed what it was. Andy still participated in daily prison life without deviation, still spoke when necessary, and still maintained his calm presence among inmates and guards. But there was an increasing sense of distance in the way he carried himself, as if part of his attention was no longer fully contained within the present environment. It was not distraction in a conventional sense, but something deeper, a sustained internal focus that extended beyond the immediate boundaries of Shawshank's physical and psychological control. As the years progressed, the prison remained unchanged in structure but not in its relationship to Andy. What had once been an overwhelming environment of control and confinement had, in Andy's perception, become something more predictable, something that could be understood through patience rather than fear. This shift did not make Shawshank less restrictive, but it changed the way Andy engaged with it. Instead of reacting to the prison as it existed moment to moment, he began to operate within a longer internal timeline, one shaped by observation, endurance, and carefully maintained consistency. At this stage, Andy's life was no longer defined by immediate survival or external validation. It had become an internal process of alignment between patience, time, and structure. Everything he had experienced, from loss and betrayal to imprisonment and isolation, had been absorbed into a quiet but persistent understanding of how systems operate when left unchallenged over long periods. And within that understanding, something irreversible had already begun to form, though its outcome remained entirely hidden from everyone around him. As Shawshank State Penitentiary continued its endless cycle of control and repetition, Andy Dufresne's outward existence remained deceptively unchanged, blending seamlessly into the structured routine that defined prison life. Every day followed the same rigid pattern, with inmates waking under strict supervision, moving through assigned labor, and returning to cells under the constant presence of authority. To anyone observing from the outside, or even within the prison hierarchy, Andy appeared to be just another long term prisoner who had adapted to the environment in a quiet and unremarkable way. Yet beneath this visible consistency, something far more deliberate was unfolding, hidden entirely within the continuity of his actions. The passage of time inside Shawshank had long since lost its conventional meaning. Years no longer felt like milestones, but like layers stacked upon one another, each indistinguishable from the last. For most inmates, this led to psychological stagnation, where memory and anticipation gradually faded into a single continuous present. Andy, however, existed within a different perception of time. He no longer experienced days as isolated units, but as part of a long and carefully constructed sequence that extended far beyond immediate awareness. This shift was not visible in his behavior, but it shaped everything he did. Even the most ordinary aspects of his routine carried an underlying sense of continuity that connected them to something larger and unseen. Within the prison library, Andy continued his quiet work of maintenance and expansion, preserving it as a space that allowed fragments of thought and learning to persist within an otherwise controlled environment. The library had become more than just a collection of books. It was a symbol of persistence against stagnation, a place where the mind could temporarily step outside the rigid structure of incarceration. Inmates who used it often experienced brief moments of reflection or escape, even if only through reading or education. Andy's presence there remained steady and unassuming, but his role within it was deeply integrated into the long-term framework he had been developing internally. At the same time, his financial responsibilities under Warden Norton's direction continued without interruption. The identity of Randall Stephens remained an invisible extension of Shawshank's external corruption, handling transactions that moved beyond the prison's physical boundaries. Andy's precision in managing these operations made him indispensable, reinforcing the paradox of his existence. He was simultaneously confined and essential, powerless in legal terms, yet critical within the hidden infrastructure of the system that controlled him. This contradiction remained unnoticed by most, but it reinforced the structural balance that allowed Shawshank's internal corruption to function without disruption. What remained completely hidden from all observers was the gradual accumulation of a process that had been unfolding over years. The small rock hammer, originally dismissed as an insignificant tool, had become part of a long and silent progression that integrated seamlessly into Andy's daily routine. Its presence never attracted attention, nor did its use create noticeable disturbance. Instead, it existed within the margins of routine behavior, concealed by consistency and repetition. The passage of time itself became an ally in this process, as years of unchanging behavior ensured that nothing appeared unusual or out of place. Shawshank's physical structure, with its massive stone walls and reinforced architecture, projected an image of permanence that discouraged any thought of alteration or escape. This perception was not enforced through force alone, but through psychological conditioning that made the idea of resistance seem futile. However, Andy's extended observation of the system had revealed that even the most rigid structures contained small inconsistencies. These were not visible weaknesses in a physical sense, but rather subtle gaps in attention, timing, and assumption that existed within any system reliant on routine. Over time, Andy began to integrate these observations into a long-term internal framework that shaped his understanding of the prison's true limitations. As years continued to pass, Andy's internal state became increasingly defined by separation between external routine and internal purpose. Outwardly, nothing changed. He continued to move through the prison environment as expected, maintaining his interactions, responsibilities, and presence without deviation. Yet internally, his focus had shifted entirely toward a continuity of thought that extended beyond immediate circumstances. This created a quiet duality in his existence, where visible behavior and internal direction no longer aligned in any obvious or recognizable way to those around him. Red, who had known Andy for many years, continued to observe this transformation with growing awareness, though without full understanding of its direction. Andy's behavior remained stable, but his presence carried a deeper stillness that suggested complete internal focus. It was not withdrawal in a visible sense, nor emotional detachment in the conventional meaning, but a sustained concentration that extended beyond the immediate environment. In Shawshank, where survival often depended on reacting to the present moment, Andy's long term internal orientation made him increasingly distinct from those around him. At this stage, Andy's life had become a continuous internal process shaped by time, observation, and structural awareness. Everything he had experienced within Shawshank had contributed to a deeper understanding of how systems maintain themselves through repetition and assumption. And within that understanding, a silent and carefully sustained trajectory had been forming for years, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary prison life, unnoticed by all who shared his environment. As the years of quiet endurance inside Shawshank State Penitentiary reached their final and most critical phase, the prison continued its routine without awareness of the transformation that had been unfolding beneath its surface for nearly 2 decades. To everyone inside the system, life still appeared unchanged. Guards maintained authority through repetition, inmates followed their structured schedules, and the institution itself projected the illusion of absolute control. Yet, within this unbroken cycle, Andy Dufresne had reached the final stage of a process that had begun not in a single moment of decision but across years of observation, patience, and silent persistence. By this point, Andy's external behavior remained entirely consistent with the identity he had maintained for years. He continued his role in the library, continued his financial work under the fabricated identity of Randall Stephens, and continued to move through the prison environment with the same calm, controlled presence that had defined him since his arrival. Nothing about him suggested urgency or deviation. To the untrained eye, he remained exactly what Shawshank expected him to be, a quiet, long term inmate who had adapted fully to the structure of incarceration. But internally, every part of his long term understanding had converged into a final alignment of timing, awareness, and execution. The system that had once seemed unbreakable had revealed itself over years of careful observation to be dependent on repetition and assumption. Guards assumed routines would never be disrupted. Administration assumed inmates could be fully accounted for within visible structures, and the prison itself operated on the belief that time alone would eliminate resistance. Andy's entire progression had been built on understanding these assumptions not as abstract ideas but as structural weaknesses. What others saw as permanence, he had learned to interpret as predictability, and predictability, when extended over enough time, could be quietly shaped. On a night that appeared no different from any other within Shawshank, the prison followed its usual rhythm. Cells were locked, lights dimmed, and silence spread through the corridors under the watch of routine security. Nothing about the environment suggested that anything unusual was occurring. Yet, behind the surface of this controlled stillness, Andy's long prepared sequence reached its final point of transition. The actions that followed were not sudden in his mind, but the culmination of years of uninterrupted consistency, executed with a precision that only time could produce. The hidden passage that had been carved over years of disciplined effort now reached its completion, revealing a path that led beyond the physical boundaries of confinement. What had once been an unremarkable detail within a cell, concealed, unnoticed, and dismissed by all systems of inspection, was now exposed as the final connection between imprisonment and escape. The structure of Shawshank, which had stood for decades as a symbol of permanence, contained within it an oversight so subtle that it had never been questioned. Andy's passage through it was not marked by noise or force, but by silence and absolute control, as if the prison itself had unknowingly allowed it to exist through its own assumptions. As Andy moved through the final stages of this passage, the atmosphere outside the prison reflected a growing storm. Rain began to fall heavily, accompanied by thunder that rolled across the landscape surrounding Shawshank. Inside the prison, however, this natural turbulence remained unnoticed by most, absorbed into the background of routine. Yet, for Andy, the storm represented something far more aligned with the internal completion of his long journey. Each movement he made carried the weight of years spent in silence, observation, and controlled patience. There was no hesitation, no emotional disruption, only the steady continuation of a process that had already been decided long before the moment arrived. When the final threshold was crossed, the structure of Shawshank that had defined Andy's entire adult life was left behind without resistance. The prison, which had once contained every aspect of his existence, remained unaware of the full extent of what had occurred until much later. Inside its walls, the system continued to operate as if nothing had changed, still enforcing routine and maintaining order. But the absence that had been created was absolute, even if not yet understood. In the aftermath, Warden Norton's carefully constructed world began to collapse under the weight of exposure and consequence. The financial systems he had built, dependent on hidden structures and controlled manipulation, began to unravel as the loss of control became undeniable. The identity that had once provided him with authority now became a liability, as the stability he had relied on started to disintegrate. The prison, which had functioned as both a place of confinement and a tool for corruption, could no longer sustain the illusion that had protected it. Inside Shawshank, confusion and discovery replaced routine as the reality of what had occurred slowly began to surface. Guards and administrators attempted to understand the breach, but the structure they depended on no longer aligned with their expectations. The system had been built on certainty, and that certainty had been quietly removed without detection. What remained was a growing realization that control had been an illusion, sustained by assumption rather than permanence. For Andy, however, the final phase was no longer about the prison. It had already ended the moment he stepped beyond its limits. What remained was not confinement but transition, an emergence into something shaped not by walls or authority, but by the long internal understanding that had guided him through every year of his imprisonment. The storm outside continued to intensify, as if marking the completion of a process that had taken nearly 2 decades to reach its conclusion. In the quiet aftermath of the events that had unfolded inside Shawshank State Penitentiary, the prison did not immediately understand the full scale of what had occurred. Systems designed to maintain absolute control were not prepared for the absence of someone who had existed for so long within their structure without ever appearing to truly disrupt it. The discovery did not arrive as a single moment of clarity, but as a gradual realization spread across guards, administrators, and inmates who slowly began to sense that something irreversible had taken place beneath the surface of their controlled environment. For most of the prison staff, the initial reaction was confusion followed by procedure. Counts were repeated, cells were checked, and records were reviewed with increasing urgency. The absence of a man who had been physically present for years within the system created a contradiction that the institution struggled to process. Shawshank was built on the assumption that everything inside it could be accounted for, contained, and verified. Yet now, that assumption had been quietly broken in a way that left no immediate explanation that could restore confidence. Within this growing uncertainty, attention quickly turned toward Warden Norton's financial operations, which had long been hidden beneath layers of controlled administration and fabricated identity structures. As scrutiny increased, the carefully constructed system that had relied on secrecy and authority began to collapse under its own exposure. What had once functioned as a silent extension of power now became a source of undeniable vulnerability. The control that had defined Norton's position no longer held the same stability, and the institution that had once reinforced his authority began to shift its focus toward accountability and containment. Among those most affected was Ellis Boyd "Red" Redding, who had spent decades adapting to life within Shawshank's structured reality. For him, understanding Andy had never been about immediate interpretation, but about gradual recognition of something deeper beneath surface behavior. In the days following the discovery, Red moved through the prison with a quiet awareness that something fundamental had changed, not only in the physical structure of Shawshank, but in its emotional atmosphere. The routines continued, but they no longer carried the same weight of certainty they once had. Red's reflections were not immediate conclusions, but slow realizations shaped by memory and observation. He recalled years of conversations, moments of silence, and the consistent calm that had defined Andy's presence. What once seemed like patience now revealed itself as something far more structured and deliberate. In hindsight, every small detail carried meaning, though at the time it had been impossible to fully understand its direction. The realization did not bring clarity in a comforting sense, but rather a quiet recognition that some actions within Shawshank had always been moving on a timeline separate from everyone else. The prison itself continued its operations, but its psychological foundation had been altered. Authority remained in place, but confidence in its permanence had weakened. Guards continued their duties, administrators attempted to restore order, and investigations proceeded according to procedure. Yet none of these actions could reverse the underlying truth that something had escaped the system that was never supposed to be breached. Shawshank remained physically intact, but its certainty had been permanently disrupted. For Red, this period marked a slow internal shift that would eventually lead him toward reflection beyond the prison itself. The idea of life outside Shawshank, once distant and almost abstract, began to take on a different meaning. It was no longer just a concept associated with release or parole hearings, but something that carried emotional weight, shaped by loss, memory, and unfinished understanding. The possibility of change, which had long been suppressed by routine, began to surface again in subtle and uncertain ways. As time continued to move forward, the prison settled back into its structured rhythm, but the absence left behind did not fade. It remained embedded in the environment, not as a visible disruption, but as a quiet reminder that even the most controlled systems contain outcomes that cannot always be predicted or contained. And within that realization, the story of Shawshank shifted from one of confinement alone to something more complex, something shaped by time, patience, and the silent possibilities that exist even within the most rigid boundaries. In the final stretch of life within Shawshank State Penitentiary, time continued its slow, unchanging rhythm, but something fundamental had already shifted in the way the prison felt to those who remained inside it. The system still functioned, routines were still followed, and the walls still stood as they always had. Yet, the certainty that once defined Shawshank no longer felt absolute. It was as if the prison had been left with an invisible absence that could not be filled by procedure or discipline. For those who had known Andy Dufresne, that absence carried a deeper meaning, shaping how they understood both the prison and themselves. Among them, Ellis Boyd Red Redding moved through the remaining years of his sentence with a quiet awareness that had slowly changed over time. Where once he had viewed Shawshank as an unchanging reality, he now began to see it as something temporary in a broader sense, not because the prison itself had changed, but because his understanding of it had. The conversations he once shared with Andy, the quiet moments of observation, and the gradual realization of Andy's internal patience all began to take on a deeper significance in retrospect. What had once seemed like simple endurance now appeared as something far more structured, as if Andy had always been moving along a path that no one else could fully perceive at the time. Years passed in this altered state of awareness. Red completed his long sentence, repeatedly facing parole hearings that asked him the same questions about regret, rehabilitation, and readiness for release. Each time, his responses reflected the same institutional expectations. Yet, internally, his sense of identity remained shaped by decades of confinement. Shawshank had become not just a place he lived, but a framework that had defined his understanding of life itself. Over time, however, a subtle shift began to take hold within him, a change not forced by authority or external pressure, but by the lingering memory of Andy's perspective on time, hope, and possibility. Eventually, Red was granted parole and released from Shawshank after decades of imprisonment. The transition into the outside world was not immediate freedom in the emotional sense, but a difficult and unfamiliar adjustment to a reality that no longer followed the rigid structure he had grown accustomed to. The world outside was vast, unpredictable, and filled with choices that carried both possibility and uncertainty. For someone who had spent most of his life inside a controlled environment, this freedom initially felt less like liberation and more like disorientation. He worked simple jobs, followed basic routines, and struggled to understand how to exist in a world without the constant boundaries that Shawshank had once provided. Yet, even in this uncertainty, the memory of Andy remained present. It was not just a recollection of a person, but a reminder of a way of thinking that had never fully aligned with the prison's logic. Andy had always carried something within him that extended beyond confinement, not in a supernatural sense, but in the way he perceived time, patience, and possibility as connected rather than separate. This understanding began to influence Red's own thoughts as he slowly adapted to life outside prison walls. The idea of hope, once dismissed or avoided for survival, began to reappear in his mind in a quieter and more considered form. This internal transformation eventually led Red to a decision that marked the final emotional turning point of his journey. Following the quiet instructions left behind through memory and reflection, he traveled beyond the familiar boundaries of his past life, following a path that had once been discussed in fragments but now carried full meaning. The journey was not rushed or dramatic, but steady and deliberate, shaped by a growing understanding that life was no longer confined to the structure of Shawshank. When Red finally reached the place that Andy had once spoken of in quiet certainty, the emotional weight of everything that had happened over decades came together in a single unspoken moment of recognition. There were no grand declarations or immediate explanations, only the presence of time, distance, and understanding converging after years of separation. Andy and Red were reunited not through the mechanisms of the prison system, but through the continuity of choices that had been made long before either of them fully understood their consequences. In that final meeting, what stood out was not resolution in a conventional sense, but the quiet realization that both men had been shaped by Shawshank in completely different ways. For Andy, it had become a place of long term construction, patience, and unseen progress. For Red, it had become a place of reflection that eventually led to transformation. Together, their stories formed a conclusion that was not defined by the prison itself, but by what each of them carried beyond it. The legacy of Shawshank was no longer just confinement, it had become a reminder that even within systems built to control time and human behavior, there remained possibilities that extended beyond immediate perception. And in that understanding, the story did not end with escape or release alone, but with the quiet continuation of life beyond the walls that once defined it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this review, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing movie breakdowns. See you in the next video.